Today we are going to talk about using photography in qualitative research. And to help me with that, I have Vivian Price, Professor Vivian Price, with me. You are a labor scholar and a union activist and a former electrician. And you have a lot of experience with using photography in your own research.
Correct.
So the first question I would like to ask you is, why do we use photos when we do research?
Photography is very helpful in getting beyond a symbolic word in which people may not necessarily feel comfortable talking about something, or they may not remember. So photos trigger a lot of ideas, and it gives the researcher a shared experience with the subject, in which the subject or the interviewee can also narrate the photograph and get into more discussion about a topic that the researcher wants to know about. You have different ways of finding photos that you want to use. There are the opportunities to use photos that the subject took themselves, or ones that are archival, or ones that researchers found or produced themselves. And each of them have different powers and different outcomes. So the first photo I want to talk about is an archival photo. And this is a photo of women sitting in a classroom. And that photo came out of the Century Freeway Women's Employment Program. And this is something that I could show women who had either, were in this classroom, and the photo, depicted them themselves, or had been in similar situations. And the photo was helpful because it started with them being able to describe the events. In this one, my question was, how did the Women's Employment Program help women gain confidence and skills in the construction trades? On the one hand, that's the information, right? The kind of objective information about it, but it also can evoke feelings. How did you feel when you were in that class? What kinds of ways, did you use that program, and how did that make you feel? So this, not only the sort of objective ideas, but the subjective feelings that come up in a photo that might not come up in a word, a spoken interview without any images.
So with that experience in mind, how would you say that having that photo there changed the quality of the data? How was it different from just asking that question in a regular interview?
Well, it would provide, for one thing, the researcher with an artifact that evoked feelings instead of just relying on memory itself. And it provides this shared experience where the researcher and the interviewee are looking at the same event or the same group of people, and the researcher is giving the interviewee the power of narrating the topic that's being asked about. So it changes the power dynamics. It can provide more information if the researcher is sensitive and gives the interviewee time to discuss not just the information that's in the photo, in the image itself, but even the symbolism that's behind the photo of, what it represents to have a women's program, and what it meant for the person's career, and what it led to. It can trigger other kinds of memories.
Interesting. So what kind of interview questions did you ask when that photo was in front of you?
So, for example, you start with a more grounded, set of questions. What's happening in this picture, and do you know any of these women? Have you had this? Were you in a class like this? what did it mean to you? So a lot of different questions, you know, and then maybe I would use the photo of another woman who's a carpenter or welder, and asks a woman, is this the kind of work you did? So.
And you also mentioned that you could ask the research subjects to take photos themselves.
Right. So there's one photo that we don't have here of a bricklayer. This photo isn't very good in terms of like using it in a film or a publication, but it's a wonderful picture because it shows, it's taken, the subject, Ethel Sledge, asked someone to take a picture of her while she was laying brick. And, you know, for one thing, it shows her pride in what she did, you know, for a living. And then she can talk about that particular job and who she was with and the guy next to her and whether he was someone who was helpful to her or not.
We have now discussed using photos in interview settings, but you also have experience with using photographs in a focus group setting.
Right.
Should we talk about that?
Yes, that'd be terrific. So this next case is about the refinery workers, and I've done focus groups where we just sat around the table and talked and had open-ended discussions, you know, starting with a research question and some kind of beginning questions. But in this case, I wanted to try to ground the interview in the experience of the workers through photography, because it was a way to move the topic from something that's familiar to something that might be a little bit more threatening or intimidating or problematic to the interviewees. So I've known this union and actually, you know, the leadership as well for many, many years. And I worked in the refinery in which some of these workers still work. So I used that as an entree. And, you know, they knew that I was there to talk about a green transition. And they were interested. But they had reservations. So at any rate, the idea was to start with images from their website. So
the union's website?
From the union's website. So the union had images of the strike there. And that's really what I, you know, was hoping to talk about, is the relationship between a workplace and the community. And so what I asked them to talk about was, what was that strike about, you know, and to, you know, discuss how openly they can, you know, speak about safety issues on the job and what it means to reach out to the community and ask them for support around issues that affect both workers and community, like pollution, like the potential of explosion if workers work too many hours. And so those are the kinds of questions I asked. Some of the questions triggered a lot of response. And I consider that focus group sort of an initial one in which I gathered data about what information and what pictures were helpful in evoking a dialogue. Right, so this third example is about the braceros, the Mexican-American workers who came to the United States under the Second World War conditions. And that actually came out of an academic study in which a colleague of mine, Gilbert Gonzalez, wrote a book about, you know, the Bracero program. And he wrote that book because he taught Chicano studies, and many of his students were the descendants of the Braceros. He thought it would be a great idea to make a film about it, and he asked me if I would help him. And so, you know, we tried to sort of create a well-documented, rigorously researched documentary that used interviews with former braceros and used photos in some of those interviews, but as evidence, but also as ways to get people talking. So one of the kinds of images we used was the mica, the ID, that many of the men still held on to. So this
it's
is
an
one
identification card for workers?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one that actually the daughter of a bracero brought. And so sometimes the many people and families held on to these because there was a promise early on, the first decade of this program, that braceros would be reimbursed for money that had been docked from their pay, and that money had been docked so that they would return to Mexico. And so they lost 10% of their pay, and they wanted to redeem that money, and they felt holding on to their mica, as well as some of them had, 30, 40, 50-year-old contracts. And many of the folks were, had to travel quite a bit, back and forth to Mexico, to different places, and yet they still had these very valuable materials, partly to recoup what they thought they might get, and that's a different story. But at any rate, and these identification cards were very meaningful because they also showed the larger context. So on the one hand, they were a way for people to talk about many aspects of their experience, such as the docking of their pay, why they still had these, and about the process of entering, and going from Mexico to the United States and what was involved, going to these different stations along the way, not getting paid for any of it, being in terrible conditions. And then they would finally arrive on the border, hungry, possibly in cattle cars, standing up, no place to urinate or take care of bodily needs. And then they would be examined. So these, oftentimes, people were very emotional. And maybe there were times when people broke down and they couldn't even talk. Sometimes they would have the cards, and that would be a way for them to talk more factually about their experience and then go into the more emotional parts of it. So
it helped harness the emotions of the interview subjects.
Right, and the memories and experiences that were triggered.
If I were to ask you to give some advice to master students who are in the early stages of a project and they are curious as to whether to use a camera or even their cell phone as a camera, as a tool in their research, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, I think it's good to start with reading about it and, seeing how the many ways, people have used this, used photography in their research, whether it's subjects taking their own photos, researchers using all of these things, producing a photo voice project. So having some grounding in the literature is useful just for sparking ideas about how you might be able to, what you might be able to do with your research. And also, thinking about what is their research question. I mean, that's so critical. What do they really want to know? And how will using photography help them to figure that question out? You have to kind of return to that constantly.
Would you say that there are particular kinds of research questions that are more apt for using photography, or are you using this method for very different kinds of research questions?
I think that there are, some questions that may not lend themselves. Quantitative may be less, useful for a qualitative study. But a study where, somebody wants to go under the surface, that wants to also see the subjects as participating within the creation of knowledge. Having a consent forum while they're doing their research, going through the human subject review, whatever, is also something I would advise them to do, because they may think, oh, I'm not going to use these images, I'm just using it for research, and then regret that they have to go back. Also learn about the composition of photography. I think it's useful to read, about and look at photographs and see how do you create a photograph? How do you find photographs that provide more meaning? That using diagonals and light and dark. If you as a researcher are creating the photographs, or if you're even looking for archival photographs that are more useful, So I guess, for a student, really thinking about what they want to know and how they want to find out that information and what they care about and how they might think of it as something that would carry on beyond this particular paper they're doing for a class or for their degree. It's very useful to think about those things and perhaps talk to someone who's done that kind of work.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Vivian.
My pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.